There are cases buried so deeply inside rural America that even the agencies assigned to investigate them eventually agreed to look away. That's not because the evidence wasn't real, but because the truth it revealed was something no one wanted the public to understand. This is one of those cases. And if you're here watching this, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this disappear into algorithmic darkness unless someone is willing to drag them into the light. And if you've ever heard of families living off the grid, comment below with what you imagine goes on behind those closed doors. Because what happened inside a remote Kentucky cabin was not myth, not rumor, not folklore. It was an anatomical and psychological implosion of a bloodline, one that produced outcomes a medical journal later described as physiologically impossible in any controlled population. The official files refer to them only as the Whitlock-Hadley case. The locals use a different name. They call them the Quiet Family. They didn't speak. They didn't leave. They didn't want help. And for 30 years, they created generation after generation inside a biological loop that should never have existed. The First Contact. In February of 1947, Health Inspector Robert Mills made the hike to the Whitlock property, a cabin deep enough into coal country that most maps didn't bother marking the path. According to his initial notes, he expected to find malnutrition, poor sanitation, and possible tuberculosis, which were common in the region. What he documented instead was something he didn't have a category for. The cabin was small 4 rooms, all of them dark, all of them overcrowded. Every surface smelled of sweat, mildew, and something Mills later described as cellular rot, a term that doesn't appear anywhere else in his reports. There were 17 individuals inside, but they did not look like 17 different people. Some sat in corners, rocking in synchronized rhythms. Some stared at the walls with unfocused eyes. Some drifted from room to room, humming quietly in tones that never formed words. And the youngest stored themselves under furniture, curled into shapes that didn't resemble any typical human posture. Mills wrote only one sentence before he left the property: "I have encountered a phenomenon." But that wasn't the first time the state had heard of them. Locals had been whispering about the Whitlock sisters for decades. The Pact. Martha and Sarah Whitlock, born in the early 1900s, were abandoned after their parents' deaths. They lived alone, isolated, surviving by creating an internal world where the outside didn't matter. They developed what later psychologists described as shared delusional structure: 2 minds, 1 belief system, 0 outside influence. When Martha married a man named Thomas Hadley in 1923, Sarah refused to accept the separation. The sisters had spent their entire lives in one emotional ecosystem. Splitting meant extinction. So Martha gave Sarah a promise, a biological promise. Thomas would be her husband too. They didn't use the word share. They didn't negotiate boundaries. They simply agreed that the 3 of them would live as one unit. This was not about pleasure or rebellion. It was psychological survival. But the Whitlocks didn't know the genetic risk they had just activated. Thomas was already related to them at a distance that would have alarmed any trained physician. Instead, the trio believed that keeping the family pure was a virtue. What they created was a closed genetic loop, a line with no sideways branches, only downward spirals. The first children. Between 1924 and 1930, 8 children were born into the cabin. The birth defects appeared faster than anyone expected. James, the eldest, developed spinal distortions by adolescence. Mary. His sister, by only a few months born from the other, Whitlock had a skull so narrow she required hand-feeding. Another child had limbs that remained curled and never straightened. 2 died before their 3rd birthdays. The sisters told neighbors this was God testing them. They refused medical help. They refused to travel. They refused state intervention. Instead, they doubled down. Closed communities develop closed logic. Closed logic becomes closed genetics. By the early 1930s, the Whitlocks had developed internal rules: cousins marrying cousins, siblings pairing with siblings, all reinforced by a belief that outsiders carried corrupt blood. What they didn't understand was that the blood they feared was their own. If you're still here with me, let me know in the comments what you think drives people deeper into destructive beliefs, fear, loyalty, or isolation. Your thoughts help shape the way we explore cases like this. Isolation becomes identity. In 1937, Thomas, the father of nearly every child, died of untreated pneumonia. The sisters didn't notify officials. They buried him on the property. Then they raised their children to believe the outside world was a threat to their survival. A human mind raised in a closed system develops its own rules, its own rhythms, its own language. By the 1940s, the Whitlock children communicated through a pattern of vocalizations that no one else understood. They learned to walk late, some never did, and they memorized the inside of the cabin like it was the entire universe. 3 generations lived within 20 miles of civilization without ever joining it. When Mills finally arrived in 1947, the damage was irreversible. The collapse of the bloodline. Mills' final report, the one he submitted before the case was seized by the state-documented seizures, skeletal deformities, microcephaly, untreated infections, and cognitive profiles that did not match any known population. But the most disturbing discovery came not from the children, but from the adults. Martha and Sarah kept notes, charts, lineages, predicted pairings. They believed they were creating a protected line. They believed the outside world was filled with contamination. They believed only the family could save the family. Their religious logic had fused with biological delusion. And when state police arrived days after Mills' report, the family fought. They barricaded the cabin. They screamed about intruders sent by the devil. They threatened to preserve the blood by force. When officers entered, 2 children were already dead, not from violence, but from the stress of the intrusion. The youngest were taken into state custody immediately. The oldest were transferred to medical facilities. The adults were committed. The cabin was burned. But the truth buried beneath this case is something most investigators never admit. This was not a story of monsters. It was a story of people who were never given a chance to understand the world outside their own suffering. And the consequences lasted for generations. There are cases buried so deeply inside rural America that even the agencies assigned to investigate them eventually agreed to look away. That's not because the evidence wasn't real, but because the truth it revealed was something no one wanted the public to understand. This is one of those cases, and if you're here watching this, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this disappear into algorithmic darkness unless someone is willing to drag them into the light. And if you've ever heard of families living off the grid, comment below with what you imagine goes on behind those closed doors. Because what happened inside a remote Kentucky cabin was not myth, not rumor, not folklore. It was an anatomical and psychological implosion of a bloodline, one that produced outcomes a medical journal later described as physiologically impossible in any controlled population. The official files refer to them only as the Whitlock-Hadley case. The locals use a different name. They call them the Quiet Family. They didn't speak. They didn't leave. They didn't want help. And for 30 years, they created generation after generation inside a biological loop that should never have existed. The First Contact. In February of 1947, Health Inspector Robert Mills made the hike to the Whitlock property, a cabin deep enough into coal country that most maps didn't bother marking the path. According to his initial notes, he expected to find malnutrition, poor sanitation, and possible tuberculosis, which were common in the region. What he documented instead was something he didn't have a category for. The cabin was small, 4 rooms, all of them dark, all of them overcrowded. Every surface smelled of sweat, mildew, and something Mills later described as cellular rot, a term that doesn't appear anywhere else in his reports. There were 17 individuals inside, but they did not look like 17 different people. Some sat in corners, rocking in synchronized rhythms. Some stared at the walls with unfocused eyes. Some drifted from room to room, humming quietly in tones that never formed words. And the youngest stored themselves under furniture, curled into shapes that didn't resemble any typical human posture. Mills wrote only one sentence before he left the property. "I have encountered a phenomenon." But that wasn't the first time the state had heard of them. Locals had been whispering about the Whitlock sisters for decades. The Pact. Martha and Sarah Whitlock, born in the early 1900s, were abandoned after their parents' deaths. They lived alone, isolated, surviving by creating an internal world where the outside didn't matter. They developed what later psychologists described as shared delusional structure: 2 minds, 1 belief system, 0 outside influence. When Martha married a man named Thomas Hadley in 1923, Sarah refused to accept the separation. The sisters had spent their entire lives in one emotional ecosystem. Splitting meant extinction. So Martha gave Sarah a promise, a biological promise. Thomas would be her husband too. They didn't use the word share. They didn't negotiate boundaries. They simply agreed that the 3 of them would live as one unit. This was not about pleasure or rebellion. It was psychological survival. But the Whitlocks didn't know the genetic risk they had just activated. Thomas was already related to them at a distance that would have alarmed any trained physician. Instead, the trio believed that keeping the family pure was a virtue. What they created was a closed genetic loop, a line with no sideways branches, only downward spirals. The first children. Between 1924 and 1930, 8 children were born into the cabin. The birth defects appeared faster than anyone expected. James, the eldest, developed spinal distortions by adolescence. Mary, his sister, by only a few months born from the other, Whitlock had a skull so narrow she required hand feeding. Another child had limbs that remained curled and never straightened. 2 died before their 3rd birthdays. The sisters told neighbors this was God testing them. They refused medical help. They refused to travel. They refused state intervention. Instead, they doubled down. Closed communities develop closed logic. Closed logic becomes closed genetics. By the early 1930s, the Whitlocks had developed internal rules: cousins marrying cousins, siblings pairing with siblings, all reinforced by a belief that outsiders carried corrupt blood. What they didn't understand was that the blood they feared was their own. If you're still here with me, let me know in the comments what you think drives people deeper into destructive beliefs, fear, loyalty, or isolation. Your thoughts help shape the way we explore cases like this. Isolation becomes identity. In 1937, Thomas, the father of nearly every child, died of untreated pneumonia. The sisters didn't notify officials. They buried him on the property. Then they raised their children to believe the outside world was a threat to their survival. A human mind raised in a closed system develops its own rules, its own rhythms, its own language. By the 1940s, the Whitlock children communicated through a pattern of vocalizations that no one else understood. They learned to walk late. Some never did. And they memorized the inside of the cabin like it was the entire universe. 3 generations lived within 20 miles of civilization without ever joining it. When Mills finally arrived in 1947, the damage was irreversible. The collapse of the bloodline. Mills' final report, the one he submitted before the case, was seized by the state-documented seizures, skeletal deformities, microcephaly, untreated infections, and cognitive profiles that did not match any known population. But the most disturbing discovery came not from the children, but from the adults. Martha and Sarah kept notes, charts, lineages, predicted pairings. They believed they were creating a protected line. They believed the outside world was filled with contamination. They believed only the family could save the family. Their religious logic had fused with biological delusion. And when state police arrived days after Mills' report, the family fought. They barricaded the cabin. They screamed about intruders sent by the devil. They threatened to preserve the blood by force. When officers entered, 2 children were already dead, not from violence, but from the stress of the intrusion. The youngest were taken into state custody immediately. The oldest were transferred to medical facilities. The adults were committed. The cabin was burned. But the truth buried beneath this case is something most investigators never admit. This was not a story of monsters. It was a story of people who were never given a chance to understand the world outside their own suffering. And the consequences lasted for generations. When the Whitlock cabin was breached, investigators expected violence. They expected resistance. They expected chaos. What they didn't expect was silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet home, but the heavy, suffocating silence of people who had lived so long inside their own world that they no longer recognized the concept of intrusion. According to the first officer inside, the children did not scream. They did not run. They did not reach out for help. They simply watched, some from corners, some from the floor, some from beneath furniture, some with their heads tilted in unnatural angles, as if trying to understand what species had just walked into their universe. Their eyes did not reflect fear. They reflected confusion, a kind of confusion that comes from encountering something you were never prepared to understand. And as investigators moved deeper into the cabin, they realized something even more disturbing. These children did not see outsiders as a threat or as help. They saw them as others, a category they had no vocabulary for. You don't have to imagine the psychological implications. They're documented, not in newspapers, not in public records, but in sealed medical files the state requested never be published. The first examinations, the youngest children were removed first, carried out in blankets, eyes wide, limbs stiff, bodies underdeveloped. One nurse wrote, "They did not cry. They did not reach for caregivers. They did not resist. They simply existed. This is not typical, even among severely neglected children. Even infants display instinctive responses, clinging, crying, curling inward. But these children had been raised in an environment without external stimuli. No communication, no sunlight rhythm, no human interaction beyond the few faces they had known since birth. Their developmental world was a closed loop. Inside that loop, the brain does something predictable. It adapts to survive in the smallest universe it can understand. When removed from that universe, the brain doesn't expand. It collapses. The autopsy room. While the surviving children were transported to facilities, 2 of the deceased were taken for autopsy. The state pathologist was not prepared. Both bodies displayed what he later called hyper-concentrated genetic expression, resulting in anatomical structures incompatible with survival. Translated into human terms, their bones had fused incorrectly, their skulls had grown too narrow, their hearts were misplaced, their organs were compressed, their connective tissues were malformed, and their DNA, what little analysis could be done in 1947, showed markers so extreme that they resembled patterns seen only in isolated lab animals after multiple controlled inbred generations. But these were not lab animals. These were children, born in a culture that believed it was doing the right thing. Let that sit with you. If you're still watching, comment. I'm here to tell me the story still has your attention. Your voice matters more than you know, because these cases fall into obscurity unless people choose to remember them. The adults, Martha and Sarah Whitlock, the matriarchs who started it all, were still alive when officers entered the home. Their reactions were telling. Martha sat with her hands folded in her lap, expression neutral, as if the world unfolding around her had nothing to do with her choices. Sarah cried softly, not for the children, not for the lost generations, but for the intrusion. They didn't understand why the state was there. They didn't understand why anyone would interfere. They believed they had built a sanctuary, a protected garden of blood, as Martha described it. They did not see disease. They did not see deformity. They did not see tragedy. They saw family. And when asked why they never sought help, Martha responded with a line investigators would struggle to interpret. A tree that bends too far toward the world will break before it bears fruit. In her worldview, the children's deformities were not signs of collapse. They were signs of resilience, indicators that the bloodline was rejecting outside influence, signs of purity. And when asked about the children pairing with each other, Sarah answered, "If you plant a garden, you use seeds from the same soil." Both sisters believed outsiders were dangerous, not because of violence, not because of hatred, because of contamination. A word they used more than 40 times in their written journals. The journals. Inside the cabin's only locked drawer were the journals. 6 of them, each filled with diagrams resembling family trees, conception schedules, predictions, birth measurements, death ages, projections of who should pair with whom. They used terms like root blood, seed branch, closed circle. These weren't the writings of villains or sadists. They were the writings of people trapped inside an inherited delusion, passed from sister to sister, mother to daughter, generation to generation. A delusion that replaced religion, replaced logic, replaced reality. And in that delusion, every child born with deformities was a test. Every death was a purification. Every intervention from the outside world was an attack. To them, the state did not rescue the children. The state stole the garden, the surviving children. 3 children were deemed salvageable by state medical examiners. Not physically, not entirely cognitively, but in terms of potential adaptation. They were relocated to separate institutions. One regained partial motor function. One learned to speak 3 years later, though only in fragmented words. The third remained silent but developed emotional attachments to staff. None were told where they came from. None were told what happened to their parents. The state made one decision that would remain controversial. They erased the family name from all public documentation. Birth certificates removed. Property files sealed. Deaths unrecorded. Autopsy results locked. The case closed under medical confidentiality, not to protect the family, but to protect the public from knowing how deep the collapse had been. The community reaction. Locals were divided. Some believed the family had been cursed. Some believed the state acted too late. Some claimed the Whitlocks had brought it on themselves. But a small number confessed something quietly, that they had seen the warning signs decades earlier. Children who never spoke, odd pregnancies, a home lit at night but never visited, whispers about keeping the line pure. No one intervened. No one asked questions. No one wanted to be the person who stepped between a closed family and its beliefs. Because in isolated communities, a family can disappear in plain sight. Not into the wilderness, but into themselves. The final assessment. The last page of Mill's private journal, the one he wrote after the state seized the case, contains a single entry. He wrote, "They did not mean to create monsters. They meant to protect themselves." But the human body cannot survive justice, loyalty, and fear fused into one idea. What collapsed in that cabin was not just DNA. It was isolation, ignorance, fear, and an inherited belief that suffering was a sign of divine purpose. The Whitlock bloodline did not end because the state intervened. It ended because it had nowhere left to go. The institutional years, the psychological breakdown, the genetic analysis, and the hidden findings the state buried. Cold, forensic, clinical, no emotion, no optimism, only documented collapse. The state's official intervention ended the Whitlock-Hadley bloodline. But the real story, the one almost no one outside the medical system ever learned, begins after the cabin was burned. Most people believe the case ended when the children were removed. But what happened in the following decade reveals the deeper truth. The collapse wasn't just genetic. It was behavioral, environmental, cognitive, and in its own way, contagious. Not biologically, but psychologically. What investigators discovered inside the institutions was far more terrifying than the deformities found in the cabin. Because the children carried an entire ecosystem of behaviors with them, behaviors formed in total isolation, behaviors no one had ever seen outside of controlled laboratory experiments. This is where the case file shifts from tragedy to something closer to a sociological anomaly. The institutions. The 3 youngest survivors were taken to separate state facilities to prevent continuation of the bloodline. Let's call them by their case initials. C1, C2, C3. Their names were changed, their photographs sealed, their documents restricted. Each child had been raised in the same closed genetic loop, yet each responded differently to exposure to the outside world. C1, the silent observer. C1 was placed in a pediatric hospital specializing in developmental disorders. He did not speak. He did not cry. He did not smile. But he watched. Nurses noted he spent hours staring at faces, not with curiosity, but with the same blank attention one might give a mirror. He mirrored motions without understanding them. If a nurse tilted her head, he tilted his. If someone tapped their fingers, he tapped his. Doctors called it behavioral echoing. But something made C1 unique. He reacted to silence more strongly than to sound. Most children fear sudden noises. C1 feared the absence of them. If a room fell quiet, he began rocking. Slow at first, then faster, as if silence meant danger. This behavior didn't exist in any documented medical population, but it did make sense. In the cabin, silence meant observation. Silence meant the adults had frozen. Silence meant a decision was being made. Silence was not peace. Silence was threat. When a doctor tried placing C1 in a soundproof chamber for testing, he had his first violent reaction. He clawed at the walls. He screamed for the first time in his life. He bit through his own lip. He wasn't afraid of darkness. He wasn't afraid of strangers. He was afraid of silence, a fear the state later attributed to generational conditioning within a closed delusional system. But the explanation raises a question. What exactly was silence used for in that home? No one alive can answer that. The adults never cooperated, and their journals avoided describing punishment. But C1's behavior suggested silence had been weaponized, not with violence, with anticipation. C2, the ritual child. C2 was the most physically stable of the three. She could walk with assistance. She could chew. She had recognizable facial expressions. But she did something none of the staff were prepared for. She created rituals. Not play, not imagination. Ritual. She arranged objects in spirals. She stacked pillows in geometric patterns. She tapped door frames 3 times before walking through them. She traced circles on the floor repeatedly, and if anyone interrupted her, she collapsed into uncontrollable panic, as if the interruption threatened her existence. This wasn't typical OCD. This wasn't trauma repetition. This wasn't autism spectrum behavior. The spirals she drew matched patterns in the Whitlock journals, not the family trees, the margins, the doodles, the symbols, the decorative marks that lined pages describing purification cycles. These spirals were the visual language of the adult Whitlocks, and C2 recreated them without ever having seen the journals. This meant one thing. The symbols had been part of the household environment long before the collapse. C2 had internalized them as meaning. But meaning of what? The state investigation team later concluded today that the Whitlocks used pattern making as a coping mechanism to reinforce the closed circle ideology. If the world is dangerous and the family is a circle, then drawing circles becomes safety. Circles become identity. Circles become law. C2 redrew that law every day until the day she died. C3, the one who adapted. C3 was the only child who showed signs of genuine adaptation. He learned to speak at age 7. He learned to smile at 8. He formed emotional attachments at 9. He even began asking questions, something no one expected from a child raised entirely outside language structure. But C3 had one trait. No doctor could rationalize. He resisted sleep, not because of insomnia, not because of fear. He refused sleep because sleep makes the house quiet. That was his explanation. And when asked why he feared the house being quiet, he answered, "Quiet is when they choose." That sentence became the single most important clue in the entire case. What did the adults choose? Who did they choose? Why did quiet matter? C3 never clarified. Either he couldn't remember, or he remembered too well. He would stay awake as long as possible, fighting sleep with every muscle in his body. Staff recorded over 200 episodes of panic triggered by lights being turned off. The room could be bright. The room could be dark. But it could not be quiet. Quiet triggered memories locked behind genetic and psychological trauma. What exactly happened in the cabin during periods of silence? The adults never explained, and the surviving children couldn't. But the pattern across all three cases was clear. Silence in that household was not rest, not peace, not stillness. Silence was ritual, and ritual was fear. The genetic analysis. Now we move into the portion of the case the state attempted to bury. In the 1950s, with advances in chromosomal research, doctors revisited samples taken from the Whitlock adults and children. The results were so extreme, the report was sealed under medical confidentiality. Here are the documented findings, written in clinical terms. Extreme homozygosity across multiple loci. Reduced genetic variability approaching laboratory inbred line levels. Multiple recessive phenotypes expressed simultaneously. Morphological defects consistent with 4-6 generations of closed reproduction. Cognitive variations not seen in any known population. One unidentified chromosomal anomaly, assumed to be an error in sample but never publicly resolved. Let's translate that. The Whitlock family was so genetically isolated that they resembled experimental lab animals bred over generations for genetic consistency. Except lab animals are monitored, corrected, managed. The Whitlocks were none of those things. Their genetic structure wasn't simply damaged. It was looping in on itself. What happens when a gene pool collapses? Two things. Physical structure deteriorates. Cognitive structure fractures in predictable, patterned ways. But one detail disturbed researchers the most. The Whitlock children displayed behaviors that were uniform. Not random, not chaotic. Uniform. A closed genetic system, plus a closed social system, had produced children who behaved like a synchronized population. Human beings are not supposed to do that. But the Whitlocks did. The psychological autopsy. When all medical data was collected, one final assessment was drafted, an analysis designed to understand what truly happened inside that cabin. The report concluded that the Whitlocks had developed an inherited belief structure, a closed linguistic system, self-reinforcing delusions, a fear-based ritual environment, suppression of emotional expression, and multi-generational trauma, encoded behaviorally. The collapse was not an accident. It was engineered, not intentionally, but through years of isolation, fear, misunderstanding of religion, and a belief that purity meant security. And the adults who started it all? They believed they were protecting their children, not harming them. That is the tragedy. The Whitlock-Hadley collapse was not the result of evil. It was the result of ignorance, fear, and love warped by isolation. The cover-up, the deaths of the matriarchs, the burned cabin, and the hidden evidence the state tried to erase. Cold, clinical, forensic, no melodrama, only the record, the silence, and what leaked through the cracks. When the Whitlock children were relocated, the state moved quickly to contain the fallout. Not for compassion, not for ethics, for fear. Because the deeper authorities looked into the case, the more they realized something dangerous. The collapse of the Whitlock bloodline was not an isolated family tragedy. It was a demonstration of what prolonged isolation, ignorance, and unregulated generational reproduction can produce. Releasing the details to the public would ignite panic in small communities, in religious sects, in remote off-grid families. And worse, it would raise questions about how long the state ignored reports that were filed long before Mills ever stepped into the cabin. questions that pointed at oversight failure, neglect, and a pattern of rural blindness the government wanted buried. So the cover-up began. The cabin is destroyed. 5 days after the intervention, a county official signed an order. Whitlock residence scheduled for destruction. The reason stated, extreme biohazard conditions and structural instability. But the photographs taken before the burn tell a different story. The cabin was intact. Weathered, yes. Dilapidated, yes. But structurally sound enough to stand for another decade. Investigators had collected only the journals and the personal documents. Medical equipment used to evaluate the children had already been removed. Yet the cabin was burned anyway. Eyewitnesses described the fire as fast, bright, and unnatural, consuming the entire building in under 10 minutes. A firefighter on the scene reported that the fire chief told his team to stand back until the structure collapsed. He wrote in his private notes, "They didn't want us near it." This wasn't sanitation. It wasn't cleanup. It was erasure, wood, furniture, clothing, beds, walls soaked in decades of human suffering. All turned to ash, all traces of the Whitlock domestic environment eliminated, except for a single object, the iron box. When the ash cooled, a local deputy reported seeing a metal container inside the remains, a small iron box half buried under charred floorboards. He removed it. The next morning, that same deputy received a call instructing him to deliver it to the courthouse. When he arrived, he was told, "There is no box." The object vanished. No documentation, no evidence record, no acknowledgement. It appears once in a draft report, then disappears from all state files. No one knows what was inside it. But people who worked the case speculated quietly for years. Some believed it held additional journals. Some believed it held the sisters' religious writings. Some believed it contained family medical samples. One doctor believed it contained something far worse, proof they were planning to continue to the bloodline in secret. But the box never resurfaced. The deaths of Martha and Sarah. The Whitlock sisters were committed to a state psychiatric hospital 3 counties away. Martha lasted 6 months. Sarah lasted 9. Both deaths were recorded as cardiac failure due to prolonged psychological stress. But nurses who cared for them told a different story. Martha refused to speak to anyone. She sat upright for hours, hands clasped, as if waiting for something to arrive. She did not cry. She did not sleep. She did not eat unless physically prompted. One nurse described her as living in a place the rest of us couldn't see. Sarah, by contrast, talked constantly, but none of her words connected. She spoke in loops, repeating phrases from the journals, repeating phrases she'd spoken to the children, repeating warnings. Keep the circle. Don't break the blood. Silence means choosing. When she died, her eyes were open. The attending nurse reported the expression as relief. Relief from what? The report does not say. But the whispers among staff did. They believed the circle had been broken, and breaking it meant death. The state's hidden meetings. Only one internal meeting transcript survived, and only because a clerk duplicated it by hand before it was destroyed. What she saved was fragmentary. Public exposure poses risk. Regional distrust of intervention. Genetic implications unacceptable for publication. Risk of similar cases in isolated communities. Recommend sealing all medical findings indefinitely. There was one line the clerk circled. We must control narrative to avoid replicating behavioral collapse. What does that mean? What narrative? What replication? Even the clerk didn't know. She only copied what she saw. But it's clear what the state feared. Not the Whitlocks themselves. Not their genetics. Not their rituals. They feared that the public would see the Whitlock tragedy as a symbol of government neglect, a symbol of what happens when entire communities are ignored until collapse becomes irreversible. So the file was sealed, officially for privacy, unofficially to protect institutions that allowed the family to decay for nearly 30 years. The final report. In 1951, a consolidated summary was written and delivered to the Department of Health. It contained 3 conclusions. 1. The Whitlock bloodline is biologically unsalvageable. 2. The remaining children must never be identified publicly. 3. No attempt should be made to locate extended family members. That third line is the one that stands out. Why avoid extended family? Were they complicit? Were they isolated? Were they equally at risk? Or did the state simply not want the public to know that the Whitlocks were not as alone as they appeared? None of those questions were ever publicly answered. The cover-up reaches completion. The case went from medical investigation to public health emergency to psychiatric collapse to sealed file to forgotten tragedy in less than 4 years. The children vanished into the system. The adults died quietly. The cabin was burned. The documents were locked away. The community pretended nothing happened. And yet, years later, a returning medical worker described driving through that area and feeling something he couldn't explain. Like the land was exhausted. Like it remembered too much. Sometimes sites of long-term suffering leave an imprint, not supernatural, not mystical, but psychological. A place can hold memory. A place can hold silence. A place can hold the echo of a family that never had a chance to understand the world outside their walls. And the Whitlock cabin site was one of those places. The surviving children's lives, the unexpected witness, and the final truth about what silence meant. Inside the Whitlock cabin, cold, forensic, investigative. No emotion, no sensationalism, just the record and what remains of it. The Whitlock case should have ended with the destruction of the cabin. But the story didn't die with the adults. It continued inside 3 separate state institutions, carried by the surviving children like fragments of a closed world. They were never meant to escape. The state believed separating them would sterilize the problem. Break the system. Dismantle the circle. They were wrong. What followed in the next decade proved something no one in public health wanted to acknowledge. Human environments leave imprints deeper than genetics. And the Whitlock children carried the cabin with them, not physically, not consciously, behaviorally. The children's divergent paths. All 3 survivors grew into adolescence under strict monitoring. Doctors called them salvageable, but that only meant their bodies could handle institutional life better than the others. Their minds were still shaped by the closed system they came from. Each one demonstrated a different manifestation of the same internal fracture. C1. The silent observer becomes an imitator. C1's first years in care were defined by copying. Every gesture, every movement, every posture. He absorbed other people's behaviors, like someone learning a language through observation alone. By age 9, he could mimic entire conversations without knowing what any of the words meant. When doctors realized he didn't understand the content, only the rhythm, they tested him with nonsense phrases. He reproduced them identically. No variation, no emotion, perfect repetition. The phenomenon was named echolalic reconstruction. Most children grow out of echolalia. C1 grew into it. His mind didn't generate thoughts the way a typical child's would. It assembled borrowed patterns. Staff reported something chilling. C1 spoke with the voice styles of whichever doctor or nurse he spent the most time near. Not their vocabulary, their cadence. When placed in group therapy, he spoke in mismatched rhythms, a patchwork of voices stitched together into something that didn't resemble any one person. A psychiatrist described it as the mind's attempt to build selfhood from fragments. But the deeper truth was this: C1 never formed an identity of his own, because identity had never existed in the cabin. The cabin had one identity: the circle, the family, the closed system. He was not an individual, he was a mirror, and mirrors do not heal, they reflect. C2, the ritual child and the crisis at St. Aloris. C2, the girl with the spirals, was placed in a long-term care facility for cognitively impaired youth. For months, she performed rituals quietly: spirals on floors, taps on door frames, object arrangements. Staff tolerated it, believing it to be trauma repetition. Then came the St. Alora's incident. One morning, the staff found her room stripped bare, bed sheets folded into geometric angles, clothing stacked according to size, furniture repositioned into a perfect alignment with the doorframe, her pillow placed in the center of the room, forming the core of a spiral made from torn paper. When the nurse asked her why she did it, C2 gave her only sentence that entire month: "Someone was coming. I had to make the circle." That was the moment doctors realized her rituals were not creative behaviors. They were responsive ones, protective ones. Inside the Whitlock cabin, ritual had meaning. Ritual had purpose. Ritual was preparation. For what? Only one survivor could answer that question. C3. The only one who spoke. C3's progress fascinated doctors. He learned to speak. He learned to communicate. He asked questions. But he also carried the greatest burden: memory. He remembered the cabin, not as a place of pain, but as a universe of rules. He described the adults as watchers. He described the older children as helpers. He described silence as the curtain. Doctors asked him what the curtain meant. C3 said, "When the curtain comes down, you do not move. If you move, they choose you." Those words appeared in no journal, no document, no adult confession, only in his memory. And when asked what happened during choosing, he shut down. He covered his ears. He rocked. He repeated, "Silence means choosing. Silence means choosing. Silence means choosing." This was the moment doctors realized every behavior the survivors displayed, the fear of quiet, the spirals, the mimicry, was connected to the same unspoken structure, a structure the Whitlock adults never described in a writing, a structure transmitted only through experience, a structure of control. What silence meant. Doctors pieced together a theory based on the fragments. When the adults wanted to enforce obedience, they did not shout, they did not strike, they did not punish traditionally. They imposed silence. Total, absolute silence. No movement, no breathing, no sound. A behavioral freeze response enforced by fear. Silence was not peace. Silence was threat. It was the pause before the adults selected a target, for punishment, for forced pairing, or for removal from the group. The journals revealed pairings, birth schedules, rituals, but they never described how the adults controlled the children. The children remembered, and their bodies remembered. The conditioned fear of silence explains C1's panic in soundproof chambers, C2's spiral rituals during quiet nights, C3's resistance to sleep, the synchronized rocking, the avoidance of stillness, the inability to rest without noise. Silence was the weapon. Silence was the ritual. Silence was the control mechanism. And that is why the state suppressed the details. Because silence as punishment is not genetic collapse. It is psychological engineering. The Whitlocks did not merely create a damaged bloodline. They created a behavioral system powerful enough to imprint across generations. The unexpected witness. This part of the case remained unknown for decades. In the late 1970s, a retired nurse from the facility that housed C3 came forward after reading an article about isolated communities. She stated that when C3 was 9 years old, he drew something during therapy. Not spirals, not circles, a floor plan of the cabin, perfectly proportioned, including the location of the journals, the adult sleeping area, the children's clusters, the silent corner, and something no investigator had ever documented, a cellar door. There is no record of a cellar in the official reports. The floor plan of the cabin shows no substructure, but C3 insisted that is where they kept the ones who couldn't stay quiet. If he was telling the truth, the original investigation missed something enormous. A hidden room. A space beneath the cabin. A place where silence was absolute. No one knows whether the cellar existed. No excavation was done before the cabin was burned. And when the site was visited years later, erosion erased any sign of a foundation. But C3's drawing matched something in the journals that investigators never connected. A symbol labeled below. A circle under a square, repeated several times. C2 drew the same symbol during her rituals. C1 tapped corners corresponding to the same position. A linguistic, behavioral, spatial memory shared by all 3 survivors. A memory of something beneath the cabin. Why the state hid the truth. The Whitlock tragedy was not simply a story of incest and isolation. It was a story of structured behavior modification, a system enforced through silence, a system that produced uniform cognitive patterns in children, a system that may have included a hidden room no one bothered to document. If the state released these details, they risked exposing the extent of their negligence, the depth of the children's trauma, the possibility that other isolated communities could produce similar systems, and the fact that the Whitlocks were much more organized than initially reported. It wasn't just a collapsed family. It was a closed society, a microculture, a ritual system built on fear. And the children carried that system into the institutions long after the cabin turned to ash. The final lives of the survivors, the missing archive page, and the chilling truth. Hidden in the state's last document. Cold, clinical, precise. No melodrama, no cinematic comfort. Just the end of a story that never should have begun. The Whitlock tragedy did not end with the destruction of the cabin, nor with the deaths of Martha and Sarah, nor with the sealing of the files. It ended slowly, quietly, across decades. In rooms far away from the woods where the family collapsed. This final part traces the 3 surviving children through their adult years, reveals how a missing page from the archive changed the entire case, and uncovers the final psychological conclusion that investigators intentionally buried. Because this is not a story about monsters or evil. It is a story about what a closed world does to the mind and what remains when that world disappears. C1, the mirror without a face. C1 lived the longest. Placed in supervised care for life, he never developed independent speech, never developed understanding, never developed self-recognition. His entire existence became structured around imitation. Nurses reported that his sense of identity was so fragile that when a long-term caregiver retired, C1's behavior destabilized for months. The new staff heard him reproducing phrases spoken by the retired nurse, in her exact rhythm, even her sighs, and the subtle clicks in her voice. He did not miss her. He missed the template she provided. Without a template, he drifted. His behavior became erratic, movements uncoordinated, phrases mismatched. One staff member described him as a person built from borrowed pieces. His health declined in his 40s. He died quietly at age 52. His final recorded behavior was striking. As his breathing slowed, he tapped the air 3 times with his fingers. A ritual, a pattern, a memory of something he had learned before his mind ever formed a sense of self. C2, the ritualist and the final spiral. C2 survived it into early adulthood, but never left institutional care. Her world remained patterns, circles, spirals, triples, alignments. Every object in her room became part of a geometry she couldn't explain and couldn't stop creating. At age 24, she went through what staff described as a prolonged silent episode, lasting nearly 6 hours. During that silence, she dismantled her room, folded blankets, stacked books, aligned furniture into a perfect radial pattern pointing toward the door. When asked why she did it, she whispered, "Because silence means choosing." The staff had heard the phrase before, from C3, but this was the first time C2 said it out loud. A week later, she suffered a sudden neurological event and passed away. The autopsy revealed no cause. The psychiatrist's note added a line that remains disturbing. She died in a spiral, hands closed in circles. C3, the one who understood, the only survivor who integrated into the outside world, was C3. He didn't live a normal life, not by any standard, but he lived independently enough to qualify for partial release at age 19. He was placed with a monitored foster arrangement. He worked manual labor jobs. He maintained minimal social contact. He never married. He avoided silence. He slept with the radio on. He ate while humming. He walked constantly. Noise became his survival mechanism. In his mid-30s, his psychological reports changed tone. He began experiencing recurring nightmares, all involving a door in the floor. He described it in detail. Wooden, square, with a rope handle, leading to a place where no one made noise. When the therapist asked him what was in the room below, his answer was immediate: the ones who didn't stay in the circle. That was the last session he ever attended. A year later, C3 disappeared. The disappearance. The official record states, subject absconded from supervised residence. Current location unknown. But an unsent letter was found in his room. It contained a single sentence. I heard the silence again. C3 was never located. His body was never recovered. His name was never restored. The file ends there. But the story doesn't, because C3 left behind more than a letter. He left behind a revelation that cracked the case open in a way the state could never acknowledge. The missing archive page. In 1999, during a routine archive transfer, a box labeled Whitlock, restricted, was opened for cataloging. Inside was a folder sealed with rusted binder clips. Within that folder was a page, missing from every earlier version of the report. A page written by the lead psychiatrist, decades earlier, and removed before the report was finalized. It was titled, Behavioral Uniformity and Environmental Encoding in Closed Populations. The contents were clinical, but the meaning was chilling. Environmental control in the Whitlock household created synchronized psychological responses across 3 generations. The children exhibited conditioned fear responses to silence, not noise. This suggests that punishment or selection was performed during periods of complete quiet. Then the line that changed the entire interpretation of the case. Silence was the mechanism through which the adults signaled which child would be removed from the group. The surviving children exhibit identical panic responses associated with anticipated disappearance. Removal. Not punishment. Not reprimand. Disappearance. The original investigation never documented any missing children. But the psychiatrist concluded otherwise. Based on survivor behavior, population analysis, and generational mapping, it is probable that the total number of births exceeded the recorded number of living individuals. This suggests undisclosed deaths or removals. And the final line. The cellar referenced by survivor C3 may have been a location for these removals. The state buried the page, because confirming it would imply the cabin had a hidden chamber. The adults used silence to select victims. Multiple children were unaccounted for. The investigation failed to uncover the full structure of the Whitlock system. The tragedy was darker, deeper, and more organized than reported. The final conclusion. What really happened in the cabin? The final assessment, reconstructed from the missing page, survivor testimony, and medical review. The Whitlock family did not simply collapse genetically. They collapsed behaviorally. They developed a closed-loop social system with rituals, punishments, and roles. Silence became the method of control. Children who failed to comply were removed during silent periods. Their disappearance was never recorded. The circle was maintained through fear, delusion, and generational conditioning. The cellar, if it existed, was the location where non-compliant children were kept or eliminated. The Whitlock cabin wasn't just a home. It was a closed ecosystem. A behavioral experiment without a scientist. A ritual system without a religion. A society without language. And the only people who could explain it were too damaged to understand it, or too young to survive it. The end of the line. C1 died tapping the air. C2 died curled into spirals. C3 vanished the moment silence returned. 3 survivors, 3 paths, 3 echoes of a world that should never have existed. The Whitlock case is gone now, buried, sealed, and forgotten. But the truth remains. Silence was never peace. Silence was never safety. Silence was the weapon that held the family together, and the blade that destroyed it. And somewhere, in an unmarked file room, an iron box is still missing.